Right. So you had brought up DAOs only making sense in a certain context if the larger governing structure, like under a larger governing structure, if that larger governing structure is going to die. So I think there are a lot of people that like they're without saying that America is going to collapse. The reason that they're into DAOs in the first place is fundamentally like they do want to have something. They want to have something where they feel secure, even if it's just a community of like digital cats or something like that, you know? And I think people are desperate, which speaks to the whole NFT craze and the kind of bastardization of the term community, I think, at scale for a lot of people. But I think in general in the Web3 space, there's this kind of desperation for something to coherently make sense and not feel like it could be psyops from the ground up. Do you think that there's like something to mobilize there, something energy there that you can direct in some positive way?
Yeah, I feel that my wife and I are doing that to some extent. Maybe not with the traditional DAO community, but I mean our work and I mean, there's a reason we're on this Gitcoin Council and everything like that, right? Like, we are beginning to gain more and more mind share within the DAO community. I mean, on the Green Pill podcast, we go into a lot of stuff and like a lot of detail in terms of how DAOs can work, because I think that these are ideas that we spend a lot of time thinking about when we're thinking about governance systems. There's so many communities out there in the world today that are looking for something better because again, the forces arrayed against us are not as competent as they are malevolent. And so it is one thing to be forced to live under a media and academic and what our academic hierarchy is within the US as a class hierarchy. You know, the university you go to some extent is used to certify class status. And now they've been ideologically captured by these wackadoos, but it's still used by our media as a metric of what's true in society. I mean, we sort of live with a priest caste, which is the affirmed academics, and the media goes to this priest caste to say what is true about this, what is true about this. And that worked when they were using the scientific method, but now at every one of these institutions there's multiple departments that are made, you know, whether you're talking about like the feminist studies department or the fat studies department, that are made just to ensure like correct think is always happening, and that we fire anyone from this institution that doesn't have correct think. And that has led these institutions to drift further and further from actual truth certification mechanisms to really just certifying an elite within our society that lords their power over people who they see as their lessers. And that is beginning to grate on people. People are getting very angry about this, and they're getting very angry that they go to this priest caste and in promise of getting this class status certification, they essentially become indentured servants to them for the rest of their lives, with these, you know, student loans and stuff like that. If we were looking at like we found some island civilization and it was structured this way, we'd be like, wow, that priest caste is pretty abusive. A revolt's going to come pretty soon. You know what? They take people's children and they brainwash them, and then they force them to be indentured servants for the rest of their life, and they put them in a position where they can never economically escape. That seems pretty evil. Won't people? And then they control what the media says is true and not true. Won't people get angry about that? Isn't this very similar to what happened to the Catholic Church right before the Reformation, where one group said truth should be determined by individuals who have spent their entire life studying it and have been certified by a central bureaucracy, and then another group of people says, hey, that central bureaucracy is getting pretty damn corrupt, truth should be determined only by the individual. Well, I think we're about to have another Reformation, and the power system that be does not see it coming. And we can use that to gather this steam that's bubbling up in terms of willpower of the people to create something new and better, because there are so many cool ideas. I think one really thing that we haven't touched on in this that is so important when you're talking about governance crafting, is that the governance gives weight to meaningful signals. And by that, what I mean is the government is appropriately judging when an individual is competent versus when they are incompetent, when an individual is invested in the state versus non-invested in the state, right? So like within our state, this means things like we could give additional voting tokens to an individual for how many kids they have that have stayed in the country, how many grandkids they have that have stayed in the country, and how many immigrants they have brought into the country that have paid for certain types of membership or whatever. So there you're creating a signal which is in the best interest of the government. We want a higher population, but it's also directly useful to the parents. Alternatively, you could modify these. Okay, you want this to be a truer signal. Actually, the voting power that they get doesn't come from the number of kids they have or the number of people they have brought in, but it comes from the taxes that those individuals pay. So they are rewarded disproportionately for raising kids who are good economic contributors and bringing in people who are good economic contributors. And that this could be even the core way that voting works in the country. Like, you have no votes that aren't that. Well, then you could have like another branch of the government where voting is determined by how much money you have donated to the government. So your vote is actually determined by how much you have paid in taxes, and you can voluntarily pay a larger amount in taxes if you want, to get more of this vote. You know, it's like a level of your patrioticness combined with a level of your competence, which is judged by your ability to compete economically on the global stage. Now you have two systems that are like judging things that we as the government want, which both lead to intrinsic growth of the government, both of the wealth of the governing institution and the number of humans living under the government voluntarily, because, you know, we would have a system where individuals can always leave if they want, which is really cool.
Right. So that last part, I think, has been getting popularized mimetically as like the exit approach, right? And I think there's this in both Web3 and in these like accelerationist groups, and I think around like maybe some of the Urbit type community as well. There's this feeling of like build an alternative that people can exit to, and like what's fundamental of these different systems is that you can leave it, right? It's you opt in, you opt out. And I guess what I'm curious is like, who are the thinkers that you feel are framing the fundamentals of your political ideology? Where if you were to give someone like a list of books, who would be like the top 3 or so to better understand where a lot of these ideas are coming from? What's
The
connecting them?
Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion is another one of our books, which does a better understanding. So our governance book is just for nerding out about governance. The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion does a better job of explaining how, well, so the core idea of it is cultures evolve intergenerationally based on biological pressures, i.e. how many children they can have and keep within the cultural group. And that using this information, we can study how society works today and how it could be made to operate better in the future, and how you can build new, better cultural groups. And that's really core to our belief. We don't have anyone who we look to. Like, I'd say if there's one book that most informs our thinking about the world, it's The Martyrdom of Man by Winwood Reade. It was written in the 1850s. He predicted basically everything about society today. He was an incredibly thoughtful person, but most people have forgotten his work. However, his work is really only interesting in a few chapters, not all the chapters, because most of it's a history of the world, and we have better understanding of the history of the world now. But the chapters that are relevant from that book are in the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion. Like, we literally just post them because it was written before copyright. So it's like, you'll get that from the Pragmatist Guide to Religion, the only other book I would really recommend. Our wider ideology can be framed like this. We want to create a society in which you have a diverse group of pluralistic cultures that allow their children to leave their cultural group when they turn 18 or when they get married. I guess a better way to put it is when they get married, if they want to. So every time a person gets married, they can then choose, am I creating a new culture or am I staying within my parents' culture? And we kind of already live in the society, but it would be better if we could enshrine this as a social mechanism in laws. Really cool was for sort of cultural evolution intergenerationally that fixes many of the wicked problems of the ways that we structure things in our society. So an example of this would be Jewish circumcision, right? Is this abuse, right? Some people would say, well, because a lot of people first they're like, well, we should let parents do whatever they want outside of hurting their kids. And I'm like, circumcision, is that hurting their kids? And then, you know, you can get to stuff which genuinely lead to like what I would consider anti-Semitic laws that prevent that, because you're using that ideology. When I'm saying, well, the way you should really do this is if you have a free society where people can choose to join other cultural groups because they don't feel their cultural group benefits them, well, then that when they reach age and they get married, they ask themselves, okay, did my parents, like, if I saw this circumcision as abuse, then I'm not going to do it for my kids. But if it turns out that something about that circumcision turns out that yes, even if the majority of people decide that they would not circumcise their own kids, it turns out that the people who would circumcise their kids are also the people who have kids. Well, then it turns out there was actually some level of cultural utility to that practice that is just not, grasped by these individuals who are leaving the community. And so it does, you get a society where cultures are able to outcompete and thrive based not on, so historically, a lot of cultures survived by telling people who left their cultural group, well, you'll be ostracized by the world, you'll be punished for all eternity. And then the internet came to exist. And, this is why Mormons have fallen below repopulation rate, right? Because a lot of the mechanisms that groups used to use to ensure that members stayed within them don't work anymore. And this is why I think Jews are doing so well right now, is their core message to their kids is, well, you'll live a better life if you stay within our cultural group. I mean, look at us, right? Look at people who aren't in our cultural group. And so if we can create a society where we have many cultural groups competing with each other, but in a friendly way, right? But these groups are meaningfully diverse from each other. They have meaningfully different world perspectives. Well, then we get to see efficaciously, like, time gets to be the judge of which of these cultures were actually the best, because kids will sort into these cultures. And a really cool way you could structure a society operating like this. Now, we've been meaning to do a podcast on this for a while. We just haven't gotten to it yet. But it's an interesting political theory that we're developing now, is to say that, so progressive cultural groups, well, there's really just one progressive cultural group. We call it the progressive monoculture. I talk to a progressive Jew or progressive Catholic or a progressive Muslim, and they'll have generally the same views on sexuality, on gender, on how we should relate to the environment, on what's true and what's not true, on morality, on what the future of our species should be. But if I talk to conservatives from these cultural groups, they're going to have wildly different views on these things. And this progressive cultural group doesn't do a very good job of motivating the types of sacrifices that an individual needs to make to create a social safety net. So, if I go to like an Amish community, if I go to the most conservative community, the conservative Christian evangelical community, they have essentially their own social security networks. They have their own soup kitchens. They have their own Salvation Armies, but they use these institutions to some extent enforce their cultural values. Well, to get people to convert out of these groups, if you are not within your cultural group, this progressive cultural group, motivating people to do these sorts of institutions themselves, well, then you need to demand the government do it, and you need to demand it take money from everyone to do it. And so through creating social security, through creating public schools, through creating, they're able to motivate people to leave cultural groups that they otherwise wouldn't have left historically. But if you create a society where you say, well, it's up to every cultural group to, for themselves, offer these services, to motivate people who are inside the group to provide these services, well, then at 18, when you get to decide which cultural group you join, is it the evangelicals? Is it the Jews? Is it the Muslims? Is it this new secular group? Well, you're also, to some extent, deciding what tax system you want to live under. I mean, that's what tithing is basically. What school system your kids are going to grow up in, what healthcare system you're going to have protecting you, what system you're going to have if you run into hard times. And I think that would be really interesting, because then you create sort of a free-floating society under a government in which intergenerationally the best systems, as judged by the systems that people most want to live within, end up outcompeting the other systems. The downsides to this is that you will get some systems that are like, we only want the best of the best to be within our group. We will kick out people who are economically underperforming. And a lot of governing structures would be very concerned by this. However, I think that there are always some groups that will find a way to profit off of these individuals, or at least find value in converting these individuals if you allow them to operate their services unfettered. Now, in America, this would be seen as untenable. It's like, what? The poor have to go to Christian-run Salvation Army camps? And it's like, yes, if they're the only ones willing to fund this stuff voluntarily, then yes, you lose some rights, to live the way you want to live when you are not effectively competing and effectively contributing, because that's really what you're doing. When you are not making money, it is because nobody wanted to pay you for the services that you built the ability to provide to the social polity. So this is our wider political agenda long term, which is a very odd political system. But I think it would work very well. Within US politics, we have a slightly different, because this is where you're just nudging things. We have a different political objective, which is really just to create as even a playing field for all of the social groups as possible. And that means lowering, ideological control of the educational system, and lowering the bureaucracy within the governing system right now, and replacing as much of it as possible with AIs. So you get less ideological capture as sort of determined by the ideology of the type of people who are willing to work within a government bureaucracy.